Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I forgot whether it's morning or afternoon. We're here. Fire's going behind me. Mr. Rogers' sweater on, and we're glad to have you join us. We're going to study today about the 11th chapter of Luke. We're going to finish the 11th chapter of Luke. Yahoo! Yours truly has taken forever on that study. But we're looking forward to your joining us. You can reach us fairly easily I happen to be monitoring it today on my iPhone. In live chat, there's a little red button down at the bottom when you first get on this YouTube program. And if you'll punch that, it'll kick up live chat. And hopefully you'll be out there chatting with us. You can also reach us, of course, at our telephone number, which is area code 317-257-3000, or you can reach us at 1-800. Out of the calling area, you can reach us at 1-800-423-2484. And we would like very much to have you join us. I think let me switch a few things around and we'll get back to where we want to be to begin this study. We mentioned to you last week that Jesus in this particular section pronounces three woes on the Pharisees. He did that starting about verse 38, 39 and went through verse 44. We studied that on Tuesday. Now we're going to switch to, he pronounces three woes on the lawyers. And we're going to start right there. Let's read the section. It's a fairly short section, and then we'll comment about it. Then answered one of the lawyers. Jesus is at a dinner. That's where the other three denunciations came from. Then answered one of the lawyers and said unto him, Master, thus saying, thou reproachest us also. And he said, Woe unto you also, ye lawyers, for ye laid men with burdens grievous to be borne, and ye yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe unto you, for you build the sepulchres of the prophets. I showed you a picture of David's tomb, or at least I think that's a model, actually, of what David's tomb would have looked like. So that's where this verse 47 ties in with our picture that we used at the first of this program. I think we used at the first.
Let's see that picture again.
Let's see it again? Oh, ouch. Ouch. It's not always that easy there, Pancho. Let's see. There it is. Have you got it? Can you get it up there? It's not that big a deal. But this is a model of David's tomb that as it would have appeared there in Jerusalem at this time. So here he is saying to them, in this sense, you build the sepulchres of the prophets and your fathers killed them. And here's one of those sepulchres that was in Jerusalem at this time. Okay, now let's go on. Truly, ye bear witness that ye allow the deeds of your fathers, for they indeed killed them, and ye build their sepulchres. Therefore also said the wisdom of God, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them shall they slay and persecute, that the blood of all the prophets which is shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, who perished between the altar and the temple. Verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation. Woe unto you lawyers, for you've taken away the key of knowledge. Ye entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered. And as he said these things unto them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to urge him vehemently, and to provoke him to speak of many things, laying wait for him, and seeking to catch something out of his mouth, that they might accuse him. All right. Let's go back and think about this. You know, there's an old adage that says the hit dog yells first. You know, if you throw a stone over a pack of dogs, the one that you hit is the first one that's going to yelp. Well, Jesus says he pronounced these three woes on the Pharisees, apparently hit the lawyers, because one of them speaks up and says, hey, if you're going to condemn them, you're going to condemn us too. The lawyers were sort of the data processors of the Jewish religion. They were very closely associated with the Pharisees. Their origin really goes back further than the Pharisees, back into the period of time before the exile, before their Babylonian captivity. They were the public recorders, they were governmental secretaries, they were legal experts, they were charged with passing on rabbinical teachings in writing. They taught, they interpreted the traditions. All public education of the Jews was in their control. They would make civil judgments. They were members of the Sanhedrin. They loved the title of rabbi. The Lord condemns them over in several passages. They wore long robes, and they very really sought public adoration. They were some of the most watchful and determined opponents of Jesus, as can be seen from a lot of places. So Jesus spends a lot of time in dealing with them. Now, the term lawyer that you see here, the term lawyer and scribe, a lot of times you'll see the word scribe are sort of interchangeable terms, and just depending on how the translator wanted to work it. The first denouncement of these lawyers was that they were totally insensitive to other men's burdens. And so Jesus accuses them of loading men with burdens hard to bear, and then refusing to help at all in relieving the burdens. In Acts 15, when the apostles comment on it, or when Peter, I believe this is, when he comments on it, he says, "Why tempt ye God and put excuse me, I can't quite see all my quote that I'm working on here. And I'm going to work on that. I'd like to quote, "Now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear?" And so, anyway, he's pretty well lambasting them for that. Isaiah had pronounced a woe on them that said, "Them that decree unrighteous decrees and write grievousness, which they have prescribed." That's in Isaiah 10, verse 1. Now, let me give you some examples of what they were doing. A Jew was forbidden by their traditions from eating eggs on the Sabbath. You know why? Because the hen that laid the egg had to work, and that would break the Sabbath law. You couldn't eat the egg because the hen would have to go to work to lay the egg. Now, nothing personal, but that hen's going to lay the egg one way or the other. But I'm not going to argue with it. It was forbidden to slaughter animals on the Sabbath unless it was a louse, a bedbug. Conservative rabbis forbade even killing a louse on the Sabbath, while the more liberal rabbis allowed people to pull the legs off a louse on the Sabbath. It's just incredible. Do you see what the Lord say? They loaded men with burdens hard to bear. If a wheat offering portion had been stored in a granary, no other wheat could be stored there. It was considered sacred. Unless a Jew swept the granary, and he had to use a certain prescribed number of strokes with his broom to make it clean. Now, this has nothing to do with the law of Moses. This was some of those grievous burdens. It was questionable whether a Nazirite with a vow to abstain from mashed food was permitted to eat an onion that had been crushed accidentally. This is the sort of stuff they came up with, and it just made the situation impossible. There's volume after volume after volume of these scribal traditions, so that they had made the situation almost unbearable for the people. in this. He says, ye yourselves touch not the burdens with one of your fingers. Now, let me see if I can show you what the Lord is saying there. Notice two or three examples. Over in Luke, here previously in Luke 11, he has talked about the tradition of Corban. And that was a scribal tradition, so that if you could say to your parents, I gave at the temple everything I would have used to support you, you didn't have to support your mom and dad in their old age. That was one of their traditions. They were going to bind it on everybody else, but they were going to lift it from themselves. They had a tradition that we could call fictitious domicile. That is, if a scribe had an important journey to make, he could pretend he had a house every 7/8 of a mile and travel that far on the Sabbath. And so he would travel 7/8 of a mile, pretend that he had a house there to take up lodging for a few minutes, and then travel another 7/8 of a mile. So he could violate his own tradition by that machinery. They also had a tradition called prosbal, which was a document very similar to Corban that was designed to circumvent the cancellation of debts. So you couldn't cancel the debt. And of course, you know, in Matthew 23, where he talks about the idea of swearing by the altar or swearing by the gift of the altar, this was sort of the way they would bind these burdens on the people, and then they would use all these machinery, all this legal machinery, to keep themselves from being burdened by it. Sort of, well, excuse me, I was about to launch into politics there. I'll try not. It would be sort of like the Senate in the United States making laws for us that somehow don't apply to senators. And that would be a bad thing. I shall not give any examples of that or make any suggestions so that I can avoid politics. But anyway, they would keep themselves away from these traditions that they demanded of everybody else. So a lot of societies, our own, have lawyers and others who keep themselves above the laws, and yet they don't practice what they preach. They demand that all the rest of us abide by those same laws. So anyway, you might be able, in your thoughts, to come up with 2 or 3 examples of that sort of thing. Alrighty, let's go on. He says in verse 47, woe unto you, for you build the sepulchres of the prophets, and your fathers killed them. The lawyers built, and this I mentioned to you Tuesday, that a lot of this is covered also in Matthew 23. And so Jesus does, in Matthew 23, cover the same sort of material. They built these ornaments, and yet they hated Jesus as a prophet. They tried to give the appearance that they revered, had great reverence for the prophets. But in their open hatred of Jesus, they were giving evidence of the fact that they had a wicked heart. And like their forefathers who had killed the prophets, they pretended to hold life sacred, and yet inwardly they were the worst killers of all time, for they killed the Son of God. There's a lot of people in our society that try to pretend they hold life sacred. And yet you do know what the abortion rates are in this country. And I see a lot of politicians who shed those crocodile tears every time there's some injustice, or every time there's some outrage in the public, and yet daily, hundreds, thousands of babies are being killed in this society. It's the same sort of hypocrisy these Jews were engaging in. Look in verse 49. Therefore also said the wisdom of God, which is an unusual sort of expression. And it's apparently a messianic title that Jesus applied to himself. In Matthew 23, when Jesus does this same sort of denunciation, Matthew 23, that's another phone line. I was hoping one of you was calling us. Matthew 23, verse 34, Jesus says, therefore I send you prophets. And then in Luke 8, wisdom is personified in the book of Proverbs, which could be a messianic prophecy in and of itself. So here in this passage, therefore also said the wisdom of God, I will send them prophets and apostles. This probably is a reference to Jesus himself. Let's go on. He says that the blood of Abel, this is interesting to me, and I've preached other sermons. I'm sure all of you who are listening deeply remember those sermons. I don't blame you. He says, from the blood of Abel, I gotta find here, verse 51, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, which perished between the altar and the temple. By the way, that wisdom of God, that passage, it's interesting. That passage referred to there in verse 49 is apparently an allusion to 2 Chronicles. Maybe 2 Chronicles 24, 20 through 22. It's a similar sort of passage. But the exact passage really doesn't occur in the Old Testament. So, you got some, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. I hate that. Pardon me. See, if we were live, you'd have to worry about shaking hands with me, or if we were there at the church building. Where did this come from? Some have suggested, well, it comes from a lost book called The Wisdom of God. Others from some previous statements of Jesus himself. Others from Matthew, perhaps the 23rd chapter, which, by the way, is probably later than this. Maybe something roughly from the book of Proverbs. My guess is it's a simple sort of a paraphrase, that Jesus is not trying to quote it directly. It's simply a paraphrase, maybe of those passages in 2 Chronicles, so that it maybe doesn't appear exactly. Here he talks about, okay, I want to talk about blood of Abel. It's interesting that he quotes from the first historical book of the Old Testament, of course, Abel back there in Genesis, who was killed. And then the blood of Zechariah is a reference to 2 Chronicles, the 24th chapter, verses 20, 22, who this is the last of the Old Testament books, or the historical books in the Old Testament. And Matthew 23 in verse 35, which has a similar quotation to this, adds the phrase the son of Barachiah, and that probably is a gloss. The prophet Zechariah was a son of Barachiah, but this Zechariah being mentioned here was the son of the high priest Jehoiada. And the prophet Zechariah, as far as we know, died, and died a natural death. And so this is probably a reference to this other Zacharias, and the son of Barachiah is which is another character. Zechariah the son of Barachiah is another character. Zechariah the prophet died a natural death. Zechariah, the son of Barachiah, dies 40 years after this incident in 2 Chronicles 24. And so that expression in Matthew 23 is probably a gloss. So the point is that there was retribution in both instances. And the clear implication of these is that they were going to come down to the death of Jesus. They were eventually going to kill the Messiah. And over in excuse me here, I can't find Daniel 9, the Lord said there that the Jewish people would fill up the cup of their rebellion to the brim and cut off the prince. And in Daniel 9:24, he says that they would finish the transgression. So it's that last killing of the prophet Jesus that determined the destruction of the Jewish commonwealth. So he says in verse 51, he says, "Verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation." So here it was going to happen. It was finally going to be filled up, as Daniel says. So Jesus exposed their hatefulness. He does three things. First of all, I mentioned to you, the first thing that he does is to denounce their insensitivity in verse 46. Then he exposes their hatefulness in that they garnished the tombs of the prophets, but lo and behold, they were the sons of those who killed the prophets, and they themselves are going to finish the work of destroying the Jewish commonwealth by finally killing the Messiah. So as he says here, it shall be required of this generation. But then the third denunciation is in verse 52, "Woe unto you lawyers, for ye have taken away the key of knowledge." And, excuse me, I took my eyes off my text. "Ye entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered." They claim to be guardians and protectors of the law. And he says, "You have taken away the key of knowledge." The key was a sort of a symbol of the function of a scribe. For instance, in Matthew 13:52, a scribe which is instructing the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is a householder, bringeth forth out of his treasure good and old. So they had the key of knowledge. They would bring forth out of their treasure good and old. And in Matthew 16, when he speaks to Peter, he says, "I'll give thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." You don't think they were actually keys, do you? No, it was, they would be unfolding the key of knowledge. And so that's sort of the expression that was used of the scribes. That was their job. But they had been selfishly exclusive in the doing of this. They declared that only rich people, well-born people could be scribes. They refused to teach the mass of the people, and at the same time accused them, cursed them for not knowing the law, and spoke about the poor in this sort of very bitter scorn and detestation. In Malachi 2 and verse 8, he says, "You have caused many to stumble at the law." They weren't making it clear. And so the lawyers opposed him terribly and were consumed with him. And so this was their third woe. You've taken away the key of knowledge. You could have explained the law, but you didn't. You hid it from the poor. You were selfish in your use of it. I'm sure what time we got. I'm doing pretty good today. We might even manage to finish this chapter. They themselves, talking about their hatefulness, they here were not lying in wait to learn some truth from Jesus that they could put into practice in their lives. They were badgering at him, sort of like vicious dogs, barking at their prey, hoping to catch him off guard so they could somehow rush in for the kill. Over and over again, they're talking about, uh, for instance, let's go on to verse 53. As he said these things unto them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to urge him vehemently and to provoke him to speak of many things. That is, to entangle him, to entrap him, the word means. And vehemently there is terribly or hatefully they were going after. They were consumed with a desire to draw out, to provoke Jesus somehow, so that they might accuse him, is how it appears in some of the in verse 54, laying wait for him and seeking to catch something out of his mouth that they might accuse him. We learn from Mark 12 in verse 13, they sent unto him certain of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch him in his words. So there was an ambassage, if you will, a group that was sent out by the Pharisees, whose sole job was to try to provoke Jesus and to catch him in some error, some falsehood. Have we got anybody listening today, Dave? Is anybody chatting with us? Oh, there we go. Here we go. Why didn't you thump me about this? Okay. Here's Rita. By faulty interpretation, they were keeping the people from knowing the truth. Doesn't that happen today? Yeah, exactly. Amen. Preach on, and you talk a while, and I'll just sit here and listen. Yes, you have an awful lot of people these days who have taken away the key of knowledge. They're not properly explaining and dealing with the scriptures. And therefore, yes, that's happening today too. You see the same thing among some of these scribes today. When you call someone out for this, they become so angry. Yeah, anybody who in their good heart has tried to teach the gospel and just sit down and study the book, and you find some people that really get angry when you point out to them, hey, you're misinterpreting this. I hope you're not doing it on purpose or for some ulterior motive. I hope that it's just an ordinary mistake. But lo and behold, it just goes on and it becomes a matter of doctrine with them, and it's a misinterpretation. Jesus met every one of these attacks and deceptions with truth. And we're going to see that more and more as this group is now hunting him down, trying to, with logic. He didn't try to wound them. He didn't try to destroy any notion that they could be saved. He did it to destroy to deal with their self-destroying plunges into falsehood and hatred. And some went willfully on in their hatred, intensifying their efforts to kill him. And a few undoubtedly were rescued. We see that a few of the Pharisees and influential Jewish leaders who became disciples, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and the world is still filled with Pharisees and lawyers who pretend to love God, but all the while studying the Bible only to destroy it, only to pervert it, to use it to their selfish ends. Well, I appreciate Rita for joining us today. We hope we've been of some use to others. We're going to go on in next week into the 12th chapter. We finally, I took too long. I shouldn't be so wordy. And we'll try to speed up a little bit in the 12th chapter. I hope you're enjoying the study, though. It's been good to be with you. This program, of course, is brought to you by the High School Road Church of Christ in Indianapolis, Indiana. We are located at 3103 North High School Road. in Indianapolis, Indiana, 46224. And we're going to be meeting. Our next meeting will be on the Lord's Day, Sunday, at 9:30 for Bible class. Brother Alan McKee, whom you've met through some of these programs, will be teaching that Bible class in the book of Genesis. Good study. And then I've promised to study in Acts 17. I did that last night. I promised to study in Acts 17 for our sermon on Sunday morning, and then Sunday, which will be at 10:30, and then Sunday night at 6. And then hopefully, if the Lord wills, we'll be back to our usual round of YouTube programs and a midweek study next week. It's been real good to be with you. If the Lord wills, we'll be able to be back again with you next week. We hope to see you on the Lord's Day. Good day to you.